Formula One drivers are some of the best in the world, and they can drive their cars consistently at the limit lap after lap. But how are they able to do this? Well, it's down to some fundamental techniques that you can use regardless of the sim you drive. There's even a technique that you can use in the sim that F1 drivers can't. So let's take a look at what these techniques are and how they can help you take seconds off your lap. First off, let's talk about braking. A common misconception is that you need to brake as hard and as fast as you can for each and every corner, regardless of the type. But F1 drivers don't actually do this. Instead, they have a variety of different braking techniques that you can adopt to your driving style. Generally, you can put these types of braking into three main categories: heavy, medium and light braking. And there's a few things you'll need to consider when choosing how to brake for a corner. Things like your entry speed, how sharp the corner is, what's next after the corner, and even elevation changes. They can all have an impact on your braking. Even the car you're driving can change the type of braking style required for a corner. For example, take a heavier, lower downforce GT3 car versus a lighter, higher downforce F1 car. The way you'd brake for these two different cars would be significantly different. And this changes depending on the speed of your car or how much mechanical grip or downforce it generates. A corner which needs a light braking style in a Formula One car might need a medium braking style in a GT3 car. So let's quickly run through an example of a hard, medium and light braking zone. A hard braking zone would be the first chicane at Monza. We're going from top speed into a really slow corner complex. We need to get on the brakes quickly and hold that brake pressure while we decelerate into the corner, which is also known as threshold braking. Then as we turn in, we gradually trail off the brakes the closer we get to the apex of the corner. An example of a medium braking zone would be Stowe at Silverstone. The aim here is to carry as much corner speed as possible. Obviously we need to slow the car down, but not as much as in a hard braking zone. And so we need to be smoother on the brake application to control the balance and keep the car stable, not throwing the load onto the front of the car too quickly. If we're too aggressive, then we have a higher chance of understeering or oversteering, which will cost you time. We also need to use less braking pressure to avoid over slowing the car. And this might seem a little bit awkward to start with, but with practice it does feel more natural. And a little hint here, you can even practice this technique when sitting in the pits. Just look at your pedal telemetry and practice a fast initial application and then a slow and controlled release. Once you've done this a few times, you can then head back out onto the track with improved pedal feel. Finally, a light braking zone would be like No Name at Spa. Like the medium braking zone, you want to carry as much speed as possible through the corner. But this type of corner requires an even lighter amount of pressure and often for less time. The main function of the brakes here is about transferring some load to the front of the car to help it turn in, rather than actually slowing the car down. And this will likely be the hardest to get right. So don't worry about it if it takes a little bit longer to get used to. And remember, each car that you're driving is different. So your braking style will also need to be different. So we've gone over braking, which is important, but what's even more important is where you look on track. So let me explain. Looking ahead on track sounds simple, but there's a lot of things you need to consider. Exactly how far ahead should you be looking? What exactly should you be looking at? And how do you know when your vision is right? Well, let's quickly see where F1 drivers are looking during different stages of a corner, so you can apply it to your driving. And let's start with the braking phase. As the drivers approach in the corner, they already know where they're going to be braking. They'll use their peripheral vision to tell them when to get on the brakes and use their central vision to focus on the apex of the corner. By looking this far ahead, F1 drivers can absorb much more relevant information, which then allows them to enter the corner at the right speed and on the right racing line. So next up is the turn-in and the apex phase. And actually, an F1 driver's vision won't move too much during this phase, as they still want to be focusing on the apex. Keeping focused on that apex allows the driver to not only turn in at the right time, but also with exactly the right amount of steering angle. And as they start to turn into the corner, they'll still be focused on the apex until just before they hit it. Then it's time to focus on the exit. So the drivers will pick their vision up and start looking for that exit point. Similar to the turning phase, they'll look further ahead to gauge when they can start adding throttle and opening up the steering angle in order to maximize their cornering speed. And once they're through the apex and into the exit phase, they'll look even further down the track to see what's coming up next. Now, this next point is something that Max Verstappen wouldn't use in the real world, but he does use it in the sim. And it might seem a little bit strange at first, but stay with me. Gearing can be used to help find you lap time. Obviously, you need to change gear to get around the track, but there's a little bit more to it than that. The gear you're in can have a huge impact on your lap time. Just take a look at the entry phase of this corner. The brakes are providing the driver with a certain amount of stopping power, which allows the driver to brake at a certain point. However, we're able to downshift as early as possible to gain additional stopping power, and it's commonly called engine braking. When this force is coupled with the car's brakes, your braking performance increases and allows you to brake later. So I've got a couple of quick examples here to show you the power of engine braking. The car on the left isn't using any engine braking, but the car on the right is. Both drivers are braking at the same point, but just look at how much earlier the car using engine braking slows down. And one thing to remember here is that higher RPM means more engine braking. So make sure you pull that downshift as early as you can. And while we're talking about gearing, you can also use a different technique called short shifting. Short shifting is when you change gears before you reach the power band, and it's mainly done to manage traction on corner exits. If you're driving a car with limited grip, you should still aim to get on the throttle as early as possible. But when the car hits the power band in a lower gear, it can cause the rear wheels to lose grip, which could end up with you spinning. This requires more throttle modulation and a potential loss of acceleration. However, if you upshift earlier outside of the power band, you're able to get on the throttle harder with less worry about the car spinning. So we've talked about braking, vision and gearing, but have you ever wondered why F1 cars look really smooth on TV, but when you ride on board, the drivers are always making lots of small corrections? Well, there's a very good reason why they do this. It's about keeping the car on the limit of grip and sometimes pushing slightly past it. Imagine coming out of a corner and the rear of the car starts sliding. Instead of letting off the throttle, which will cost you time, these small corrections can help you control the slide and stop you from having to release the throttle, which ultimately stops you from losing time. GT cars and production-based cars will have a bigger window for making these types of adjustments. They allow you to make larger corrections more often while still keeping that forward momentum that you need. However, faster cars with more aero, like F3 prototypes and F1 cars, won't allow you to make as big of a correction. So let's take a quick look at an example. We're going to look at turns 5, 6 and 7 at Spa in an F1 car, then an F2 car, and finally a Porsche Carrera Cup car. The F1 car needs very small corrections when going through this complex. The downforce, along with the tyre's mechanical grip, stops the need for any big corrections. Now let's take a look at the F2 car. You'll notice that on entry compared to the F1 car, they make a few more corrections. The F2 car still has lots of downforce, but a lot less than the F1 car, and it's the same story through the mid corner and the exit. More corrections can be made and keep the momentum going. Finally, let's take a look at the Porsche Carrera Cup car through the same complex. The driver is almost constantly adjusting his steering inputs to make sure he can get through the corner as fast as possible. There's obviously a lot less downforce and is relying much more on the mechanical grip. When the tyre starts to break traction, a bigger correction is needed to bring the car back from being past the limit. And regardless of the car that you're driving in the sim, you'll still be able to use this exact same technique. Just keep in mind that you'll need to experiment with how much and how often the corrections can be made. One of the most common mistakes that we see with the thousands of people that we've coached is when they start getting too confident with their car control and make huge corrections way too often. If you do start overdriving and being too aggressive, the car will start to become unstable and unbalanced, ultimately costing you a lot of time. Now, remember earlier, I mentioned you can do something that F1 drivers can't. Well, Well, it's adjusting your brake bias more towards the rear of the car to help you corner faster. This technique is actually a little bit of a quirk in the sim, and while it does make you faster, it is quite hard to perfect, which is why all professional sim drivers use it. Brake bias is the amount of braking force that's applied between the front and rear axles, and it's normally measured by percentage. The higher the percentage, the more pressure is being directed to the front axle. This is why in real life, brake bias is normally quite far forward, since most of the load shifts to the front during braking, but in the sim, you can use a lot more rearward bias. And the most important benefit of running more rear bias in the sim is in the turning and trail braking phase. More rear bias means the rear wheels are going to lock easier than the fronts, and while it's slightly harder to control, you ideally want the inside rear tyre to lock up before the inside front. If the inside front wheel locks first, you lose turning ability and you'll start understeering. And to get the wheel to start rotating again, you'll have to start releasing the brake pedal, which then means that you might carry too much speed into the corner and run wide, which will cost you time. However, if the inside rear locks first, it'll help you turn into the corner. Now, if you do this too much, you can potentially get too much oversteer, which isn't ideal and will cost you time, but you'll still be able to turn into the corner. And so if you do lock up the rear, just release the brakes to get the wheel rotating again, and you'll have a better chance of making it through the corner and only losing a fraction of the time. And like I said, just make sure you don't put the brake bias too far to the rear. There is a sweet spot with this, so you need to experiment with moving the brake bias back in small adjustments. If you want to know more about F1 drivers' techniques, then check out this video where I break down exactly what Max Verstappen does to make him an alien in the sim. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.